I'm now going to show you how I can create water material for the river, the water we have. Now, because there's so much reflection with water, it's a good idea to now kind of set up the look of the sky. If you have the advanced renderer module, you can add a sky object. So you can create a sky, which is what I'm going to use. If not, if you're just using the standard Cinema 4D with just MoGraph, what you can do is create, just for a pretty decent sky, adding in an infinite light as your sunlight, and then you can create a new material. I'll go ahead and edit that, turn off the color, turn off the specular, go to the luminance channel, and then set that up for a gradient, 2dV, and then you can create, dragging about the center, kind of a lighter blue tone, and then a darker blue for the top. So just a basic sky that way, and then you would need to apply this material to an object in the background. So you can go ahead and use the background object. And that can be kind of our starter sky. But I'm going to use the sky object, and we're going to need to modify the attributes to change a couple of things. I'm going to go over to the sky, use warm colors. Under the sun, the shadow type is set to area right now. I'm going to switch that over to the ray trace for the moment, just to cut down on render time while just kind of previewing. We can go to the main viewport and we can see what's going on a little bit better. And you can set up city and time in order to place the sun in the direction you want. So what I'm using, you can see the layout right here, so if you want to adjust your values to match. Latitude being 51, and then 0, and 40, and longitude 14, and 37, and 22 east, and then latitude was north. And then daylight savings I have set to last March Sunday to last October Sunday. DS time zone 2 and time zone 1, and time is 10, May 4th, 2010. I don't really like the way the lighting is set up here, so I may go ahead and decrease the look and just kind of raise it up to 7. And that's something that looks a little bit nicer. Maybe bring it up to 8. We can always change the time, modify all this stuff, just kind of tweak it to get it to the state that you want. And that object up there is not a UFO. If we go over to the Details tab, we can choose to show the moon, stars, and planets. So go ahead and turn off the moon, stars, and planets just to get the sky and see that showing up. If you want to change the texture preview size of the overall material, we can modify this main output to see whether or not that is for everything or just the details. But it looks like that's probably for everything. Double check by changing it over. So if you need better detail, especially if you have any clouds or anything, you can increase that. And it does look like it's still showing a planet or the moon or something in there, which was not showing up in the final render. So we could just ignore that. So let's go ahead and modify the water. open up our objects, and I'm going to select the water and turn it back on. And then I'm going to go ahead and hide the other one from the view as well, the effector, which was showing earlier. The water, what we can do is create a new material. I'm going to delete that temporary sky I created before. I'm also going to go ahead and set up a new layer for this material. So let's go ahead and add a material that's going to be our water, and right click, add to new layer, and double click and call that water. I'm also going to go ahead to the layer browser and change that to a darker blue. In that way, if we want to use the display layer color, it'll look a little bit better. So I'm also going to go to the landscape and modify that. Just give some better separation. So we'll go ahead and change the display, turn off the layer color, and now modify our water. So we can double click on it. You're going to start out by going to color and changing this to more of a blue. Actually, I think maybe a greener color might be a little better to start with. And then we're going to turn on the transparency, and we're going to change the refraction to that of water, so 1.333. And so we can see this a little better. We can go ahead and render this out at the current state, which isn't going to show anything because I have not applied the water material to the water object. So that is important. Go ahead and re-render that. Now we can start to see the water and the refraction. Okay, so what we want to do is adjust the absorption distance. So basically how murky the water is, how far we can see into it. So if we reduce that down to 50, and I'm going to keep, or go ahead and change the absorption color, which is going to end up being the primary color of the water in a way. So we can make that kind of a murky green if we wanted. And that is also going to change the absorption and the way that works. So we might need to increase it, just kind of adjusting it to get it to a point where it's going to look good. Another thing to keep in mind is we don't have a bump set up, and the reflection is set to 100 right now. So we might end up seeing more of the refraction than we do the bottom of the water. So if we want, we can turn that down to maybe 15 for now, just to get an idea of what the water is going to look like. We'll reduce the absorption to 50, and now we can start to see darker spots. Let's go down to 10, and I am not working in real-world scale, so that is one thing to keep in mind. I'm going to go ahead and just reduce that 8 centimeters. You can darken it up even more. So now you can adjust the color if you want. Maybe a little more blue. Overall, that doesn't look too bad. We can see a bit of the sandbank, and then it transitioning into the water. So we'll go ahead and turn the reflectivity back up to 100 for now. If we need to adjust it further, we'll have to see how the bump turns out. So let's go over to the bump channel. So we're going to create the displacement of the water. I'm also going to go to the specular and decrease the width, increase the height. And back to the bump, we're going to set up a noise. And I'm going to use, well, we'll have to go and see which is going to end up being the best, especially if it's going to be animated, then that's going to be really important. If you want to use something other than just the basic shader for this, there are some presets that come with Cinema, or you can set it up manually. If you go to Load, Preset, Materials, Banjai, You could set up one of the glass materials and just modify the refraction. So if we were to add that in, go to that glass, and under transparency, change the refraction index to 1.333, and then we can modify the additional values to look more like water. So actually, we'll go ahead and just take a look and see how that will work as the water. It looks like it's going to take a lot of must be a lot of modifying in order to get that to work directly. So I think we're going to end up better off with the other one, at least for now, just because it's a much quicker setup. So now we can see just that lower level bump. So we do need to modify the noise. And I'm going to set this to the wavy turbulence. And we're going to see how that turns out. Probably need to modify some of the different values, maybe the scale, and whether or not we want it to kind of go inside out. If we set it to absolute, we might get something that looks a little bit better. And detail attenuation up to 1000. We can adjust the octave amount maybe to 7, increasing the detail. It's just kind of a basic rough water. And if we want to animate it, there's two different ways. We can just set up an animation speed, an overall change of the noise, or we can use the movement of the noise plus speed. So a combination of those together, you'll be able to create animation with that. This is just kind of a basic setup for the material. Looks like I might need a slightly better anti-aliasing setting to be able to really see that a little bit better. So I'm going to go over to my anti-aliasing and change the max level to 2x2. If it's still a little too grainy, it's possible the reflections are going to be a problem. So what we can do is modify either decreasing the amount of octaves, which will decrease the amount of noise or overall detail. So let's say we bring it down to 3 and render it out. It's not going to have as much turbulence, so the reflections are not going to be as distorted. But I'm going to bring that back up to 5, and under transparency, you can see the Fresnel reflection doesn't have a direct blur. So we might be able to just blur everything out using the blurriness transparency. But it looks as if it really is the reflection causing the problem and not the transparency at all. So I'm going to go over to the reflection. Even though it's not enabled, we can use the blurriness to blur that out. I'm going to turn down the sample amount, max sample 65, and then go ahead and take a look to render for that, and see if that takes care of that noise, and it looks like it is. So that definitely looks much better. It's also important to keep in mind that the bump surface on our material may also be playing a small role in that. So if needed, you might need to make some adjustments, but we'll take a look at that later if it becomes a problem. If not, we'll just kind of keep it the same. So we'll go ahead and stick with that. Just for the sake of previewing and rendering quicker for now, I'm going to turn down the blurriness amount, or we can just set it to 0 and not blur it right now and not really worry about it until the final render, where we go ahead and increase it, or if we need to run a test to make sure that there's no flickering with the water surface. So let's go ahead and turn on our clones. Just to get a rough idea of what it's going to look like with the objects in the water, and whether or not they need to be moved down or up. I just want to note, one way to really improve the refresh time for sampling frames is just close out the viewport and just adjust the timeline, which goes really quickly, and then you can render it out just previewing and showing the picture viewer. So that we don't need to worry or wait for the OpenGL to refresh if you already have a sense of the timing of the scene. So that's one thing less to worry about, which is pretty nice. Once we go back to the main viewport, it will need to refresh and add those objects back to the scene. So what we can do, it looks like, go ahead and turn off the water as the selected object, and we can go all the way to the last frame, which is going to refresh basically everything. We also want to make sure that the objects are showing in the viewport, which they were not. And then we'll be able to scrub through, once everything's loaded, pretty quickly. Sometimes it just takes a second for all of the objects to reload and kind of get stored in the cache. Once that happens, we can usually refresh things a lot quicker. So just kind of waiting for that refresh point. I've gone ahead and grabbed some of the rock objects I had baked and just loaded them into the scene. What I want to start with is changing these rock materials that have come in and adding them to either a new layer or a layer set up for elements of this type. I'm going to add to a new layer and call it rocks. And what I want to do is use the shader setup, or the alpha, that is controlling where the sand is showing, to add rocks over the bottom surface of the water area, and kind of going up the edge a little. Now, one thing I need to do is adjust these scales, because at the moment we've got some big differences, mainly between rock number 3 and then 2 and 1. So I do want to change the size of these objects. It's also going to be important to set up exactly how we want to place these onto the terrain. In other words, controlling the object axis, if we want to just kind of center them or have them protrude slightly above. I think we're going to get the most flexibility really by keeping it almost centered, because that way what we can do is rotate them around to make them look different and not have to worry about them going too far above the water. So I'm going to go to the coordinates, actually reset all of them to 0. I'm also going to turn off any modifications I've made to the rotation. And then going to the first rock, I'm going to modify the size to be 1. And just, we want to make sure, now going to the model mode to scale this other one up, I just want to make sure they're pretty much equal size, and that way I can control the size variation with different effectors. So now these rocks are set up, and we're also going to add that to a rock layer that we set up. And change the color of that to a darker gray, maybe with a slightly brown tint to it. So we need to create a new cloner object, or we can duplicate from the other objects that we have controlling the plants. We just need to modify the effectors. It can be a little bit easier, especially with some of the additional setups that we have. Now, the rocks I don't want animated, I do want them static, so pretty much we can remove virtually every single effector that we have. I'm going to grab the plants, copy and paste it. We're going to call this rocks. Go inside and delete any of the plants that are in there, and then since we're already set up for the landscape, a lot less work overall, I'm going to modify the count to 200 just to start with, so we can get the scales and everything set up. And then under the effectors, we want to make sure that we have pretty much everything removed. Unless we wanted to use that camera volume effector, but we'll see depending on the output. So let's go over, and I'm going to turn off the sort mode for this one. And we're going to just overall use a different setup. And now we need to set up the shader. First I'm going to go ahead and grab the rock objects and add them to the cloner, which is going to create our clones. I also should probably modify the materials first before I go ahead and turn this on. So what I'm going to do is open the material editor. We're going to select all three of these materials in the rock materials, go to the editor, and modify the display preview size to something a little bit smaller to begin with. And wow, that's one of the first crashes I've had in Cinema. So it looks like I will need to redo this again, and I'll start up where this came from. So maybe you should not change the texture preview size altogether, or maybe it just had to do with the fact that it wasn't refreshed yet. So just kind of keep that in mind in case this happens to you. So be careful. Alright, so we're back with a working scene. And what I want to do, now that I have the rocks added in here, is to set up the amount we want to have. Let's go ahead and set it to 3,000. If you want to have larger rocks, we can increase the transform, make them a little bit bigger, depending on the type of rock you want to have. And in this case too, I also turned on the align clone, which is going to align it along basically, and conform more to the terrain basically. We could also set an up vector to kind of rotate them around a little bit more. I'm going to choose to use none. And then if you want to have any additional transformation in order to maybe make them protrude a little from the sides, we can set up the pitch and maybe a little bit of bank, some heading, and just modify those a little bit more. I'm going to go back to the transform, and we're going to go ahead and set that to 0.4 or 0.38. Let's use 0.38. And flatten them up a little bit more. If we need to adjust the heading, if too many are looking the same, then we might need to set that up vector. And it's going to look a little better distributed. So now we want to set up the shader to remove the objects outside of the water area. So we can just directly use the shader by adding in from the MoGraph menu the shader effector. And now under shading, we're going to choose to use the alpha, and now we need to choose the texture tag, which is going to be the sand texture. And our effector, we're going to modify now to change the visibility. And we just need to set this up in order to just remove certain areas and just the bottom. Also making sure that the shader effector is within the rocks. So that is really important. One thing we could do for this, let me turn off the color mode. Change the transform mode to absolute, set scale 0, absolute, and might need to refresh the object. And I'm going to go ahead and turn this down to 500 for now. And we're just going to look and see if we get those top ones removed. So we'll just go over to the shader and then set this up. And it actually looks like there's just an incompatibility with using the alpha channel because it is set to the 3D mode. That might be causing the problem because I'm actually unable to haven't been able to get it to work. So we can try to just really quick invert, maybe adjust some of these settings. But it doesn't look like it's shading correctly. It's really an overall change. So what I think I'm going to end up doing is instead using a different type of effector. So we can just reset the channel, reset it to default, and instead go to the fall off and just use this mode. So under parameter, making sure that visibility is turned on. We can turn off the scale for now, and we're just going to do this the normal setup. We can set it up with a plane, so being linear. And then we need to just make sure that the effector is applied, which it is, because it didn't really change anything over. Go to our fall off, set it to a linear. And we can set the minimum maximum to 100. Invert the fall off, which means we may need to bring some of these values back a little higher. And then we need to adjust the angle, so the orientation. And we want just the opposite of that. So we're going to go to the negative y. And we could just change the scale this way. Just the fall off, maybe raise it up a little bit more. So we have a reduced fall off. We can have more objects within the area. If we want a almost definite amount, really reduce the fall off, and then add those in. So you can see between the invert and having on and off, there's a rather large gap. So that partially has to do with the fall off, but also the offset and the way the minimum and maximum values are set in order to really get them to show. But I find that this just works out pretty well. Okay, so we'll go to the rocks, and now we can increase the count. If we want to make it 5,000, we can make them huge. So lots of rock coverage. If we need to take that rock shader, maybe pull it down a little bit more, and now there's a lot more clones, it's going up a little higher. I also want to set up a random effector to adjust the scale. So we'll add in random effector and call this rock rotation. Make sure that is added to the effector list. Turn off under parameter the position. Just set up the rotation. And we'll go ahead and just set some values for the heading and the pitch. Just leave it pretty high values. We also want to index it, and we can synchronize it as well. If too many of the rocks look the same, then turn off synchronized, and you'll get a little more variation. We can also change the variation mode to the random mode. Sorted is going to give us some nice rock coloration, kind of grouping them together. So that might work out pretty well. Which isn't going to really make a change with the synchronized mode. So we could also use the effector transformation space if we wanted to. I really just gotta pick and choose, see which one's going to look the best. Object and effector will be the same because there aren't any major modified rotations or axes for the object it's populated on or the cloner object itself. So I'm also going to turn on scale, and we're going to use a non-uniform scale. Turn it to absolute. I'm going to go ahead and do some different changes here. You can give us some nice scale variation. If we turn off the absolute scale, what's going to happen is we're going to get a lot of very minimum amounts, which could possibly create too small of objects. So if we go ahead and turn that, just going over to the effector and turn down the minimum, then we can adjust how much transformation or changes there's going to be without having to go into the cloner object and modify the scale. And then if you want a different setup, you could change the seed amount or the seed value to show up in different areas. And I'm going to go to the rocks, transform, and just reduce the overall size so that I can really put more in the scene. We do have 5,000, but if you want to have more, you can set that up. Also keep in mind that we still have that other rotation being set up within the cloner, so then we can add even more adjustments to this. And since these won't be animated, we can really do a lot more with them. So these are going to be static rocks. And I am noticing a big difference between the render output and the preview, whether or not it's because the display, it does not look like the tag is restricting that at all. So I think I'm going to modify the overmax bank value. Let's go ahead and increase the count. Because typically the display and the render are really well matched. It looks like in this case we have a largely reduced output in comparison. So the viewport is showing a lot more, even though I mean a lot of these are going to be under the water. Still, a lot of the clones showing on the edges are not showing up in the render, or they're really showing in different places. So we just got to keep that in mind. I'm going to go back to the rock shader, and we can raise it up to increase more rocks around the edges. And if we want to bottom it out too, we can adjust the fall off amounts, and we could even take the fall off, possibly bring it over to step, invert it, and then if I bring this down, we should be able to just reduce the range, adjusting the fall off amount, and possibly adjusting the scale. This way we won't have as many on the bottom if we don't want them. I'm going to go ahead and turn off the clones for just a second so I can adjust this a little easier. And then if we need to reduce the fall off amount with the handle, we can make that adjustment very easily.